Hello everybody, thank you all for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to show you guys a few little tips and tricks that you can do to improve responsiveness of a website using a little text wrapping, especially in certain instances where you may have text off to the side of an image. So without further ado, let's dig into the code. Okay, so I have a CodePen sample here for this video. You can find a link to this in the description below. And I have a basic sort of bio section, if you will, that you'd see on a web page when you have a section when you're talking about certain people on a team or just certain people in an organization altogether. And so you have an image right here that I've set with a circular border radius, and then you've got a heading for the name and then some dummy text here. Same thing over here. I've kind of inverted everything, so you kind of have this one odd one off to the left and then the even off to the right, and if I were to keep going further, it would just keep doing that with the way I've written the CSS. And I'll show you a bit of the HTML code that I've written here. I'm going to expand this out for you guys. So I have everything pretty much wrapped inside of a main tag with an H6 for the heading, which shows the mode. Right up here, you can go between float and flexbox. I've made some notes up here that allow you to sort of toggle in between, which I've written with JavaScript just to make the demonstration a little easier and something that you guys can play with just to kind of be able to follow what's going on here. So you have that. You also have this box container, so everything's contained, which is right around 1200 pixels. So obviously if you go wider, it'll only go so wide without stretching too far, making it too hard on the eyes to read. So then you got the image here for your image, obviously, and then you've also got a heading text container with an H4 for the name and then a P for the body, which is, again, just a bunch of dummy text. Same thing for the other person. So I'm just going to expand this back out for you guys. And as I was just showing a little bit ago, you kind of had this little mode here that you could toggle with the JavaScript between float and flexbox. As you can see, when I toggle between, you don't see much of a difference other than just a little slight fluctuation in the background. But I want to start by showing the flexbox mode first before I get into the float mode. Okay, so you probably heard about floats, and you probably heard a lot of negative bashing and stuff on forums about web development. But the reality is with floats is that they were used at one point for doing layouts back before they had Grid and Flexbox. And it was used in ways in which it was never really intended for. It was never intended to have multiple items floated going right next to each other. It was really intended to have one item float and then have other elements wrapped around it, in particular with text. So don't get too swayed away by hearing the word float. We're going to use it the proper way, and I'm going to show you how. Okay, so before I get into how I've done things in the float mode, I just wanted to start off with Flexbox mode first. And the way I've set things up is I've have these images and the text for each person wrapped in an article container, which is actually right down, I'll expand it a little more, right here. So if I zoom out, sorry about this guys, you can see the little gap right in here that I've made to keep space between the image and the text. And then what I did for here, because the HTML is the same, I just used a flex direction of row reverse as opposed to here where I just did a regular row. And I've set it up in the CSS with the nth child of each of the, inside the sections, each nth child of article to be a row on the odd and then a row reverse on the evening. So if I were to add more of these, they would just, naturally alternate. So now let me show you what happens with the responsiveness of it. You've kind of seen already what it looks like on the wide where it's boxed at 1200. You got the text here, text there. This text down here is a bit longer, so I've let it wrap down there. So now as I shrink, it starts wrapping, it starts working its way down, and then eventually it all just stacks. Now, you probably notice here that there's a little bit of space here, a little bit of space there, because I didn't want the text getting too wide and making it too difficult for a person to read, not having to scroll their eyes too much. And then as we shrink, eventually that works. And then you got padding on the sides here to maintain space. And then as you get smaller and smaller, eventually the image and the text shrinks. And this is down to about 360 pixels here. So this is about as small as anybody's ever going to look at it on a mobile device. Okay, well, it looks like Flexbox is doing a pretty good job of keeping everything responsive, keeping the text, right off to the side of the image and then stacking at a certain point with that media query. But why, go a step further with the float thing? Let me show you something. So now I want to move into the float mode, where I've taken things a step further than what you saw in Flexbox. So I'm just going to go ahead and toggle that. And that pretty much starts off, very similar look to what we had with Flexbox on a wide screen. And now I'm going to shrink it down and watch what happens with the responsiveness of the text. As I start to shrink, you kind of notice that the text, instead of just staying off to one side here, it's actually starting to wrap underneath the image. Same thing with here with this John Doe sample. This isn't really his name, by the way, I just made that up, but you notice the text is kind of doing a nice little wrap under the image. It's not just staying off to the side like you saw in Flexbox. And then once we get down smaller to the mobile, we're pretty much getting the same thing we have in Flexbox. So pretty much at this point, it's kind of all the same with Flexbox on this resolution and lower. So I'll bring this back out here. And you probably noticed that as I shrunk this, it seemed to be able to go smaller on a smaller screen than it did with Flexbox. If I toggle to the Flexbox mode, it stacked at a higher resolution. Whereas if I switch back to the float, it still keeps going. And the reason for this is because of this text wrapping you see here. Because the text wrapping allows things to still be fairly readable, and the text isn't going to get all squishy like you get in Flexbox. Because even at this higher resolution, you notice this text is just getting taller and taller in proportion to the image, which is why I made it stack or set the media query at a higher breakpoint for that reason. Whereas with the float, because I was able to get the text to wrap underneath it as this grew taller and it started wrapping further down, I could set that breakpoint at a lower point, to the point where the name of the person got too small. And another thing you probably noticed is the point in which it breaks. We're maintaining, not too big of a gap, your typical gap that you'd see, as opposed to Flexbox, where you have more gap. And I could have allowed it to go wider, but again, I don't want the text getting too wide and making it too difficult for a person to be able to read. That's why you have this extra space. I've essentially set a maximum width on the article containers. Now, I figured I'd show you guys a little bit about how floats work now that you've kind of seen them in action with this and all, with it wrapping underneath. I'll just show you guys a little something that I've added in here just to kind of demonstrate what's really going on. So I'm going to highlight the text You got green for the name heading and then blue for there. You kind of notice that they seem to kind of tuck up underneath. It's almost as if this image is, just hovering above it. And that's kind of one of the names for, they call float there, which it's a little bit like position absolute where no space is allocated for it. However, it's not quite the same, and I don't want you guys to get confused at all with difference between position absolute and float. So what I'm going to do is I'll put a position absolute on this first person here. Sorry, I can't spell right. And you notice that with position absolute, that text just completely ignored the image. So that's kind of a difference between position absolute and float, so you guys don't get confused. But anyhow, I'm going to bring this back to here. And as you notice, as I was mentioning earlier, that this whole, was it H4 and these P tags just span the whole way. And the reason it does that, and the whole reason that the image is stripped out, is that way these things, these text fields, can move up to the top and sort of tuck underneath it. So think of it like this image is literally floating above, it's no space is being allocated for it, but other elements can observe this floated item and can wrap around it, as you can see here. So this text, this whole block area, as part of the block model, it's kind of tucking up underneath, but the text is kind of almost observing this floated item and just trying to stay clear of it. So that's kind of how it's working in a nutshell. Whereas with Flexbox, if I switch to there, it's not really doing that, and that's a big reason why with just Flexbox only it's not wrapping, because it's completely separating it away from the image here. And this one I just had to put in another container, that's why it's spanning the whole width right there. And one more thing I want to show you guys before I wrap up this video here is something called clearing the float. And I'm going to explain to you a bit of why that is, well, what it is and why you'd want to use it. So on this first one here, we've got this dummy text for the person. If I cut that off, or that text is shortened, you notice how this other article of John Doe kind of tucked up underneath it, because the height of that article is now only allocating for the name and for the body. It's completely ignoring the height of the image, and that's how it's able to wrap around it. But in some instances, you may not want something below it to be wrapping up underneath like this, or trying to tuck up underneath. So oftentimes what you'll want to do in that kind of instance is apply something called a clear float. And what typically is done is there's this clear fix right here, and a common practice that they did back before they were doing it with layouts, which caused all kind of problems because they weren't using it like this with just one floated item, is they would apply a clear fix, and they would create an after pseudo element, and then they'd have to apply content here, and then they would do clear both, and then you could apply display table, or in this case I just did it as a block. And so what you would do is come on here, you would want to apply clear fix right onto here, and you would just say, just type it in, and then that would fix that issue. So now it's regarding the height of the article. You've created a pseudo element right after all the content, and you're telling it to clear under this floated item, so then that after pseudo element goes underneath, and that's how you can prevent that issue of something wrapping underneath inadvertently. Okay, so that pretty much sums up what I wanted to show in this video here, and to show you the proper use of using floats and how you can integrate them in certain situations to improve your responsiveness a little better. Now don't get me wrong, Flexbox is great and all, and the Flexbox solution will work, but in certain instances where you have a two-column layout with an image on one side and then text off next to it or to the left or the right of it, it sometimes can be a little better to use floats, as you saw, because you can improve responsiveness a little bit, and you're not setting a breakpoint at a higher resolution and then forcing to have all this additional space to avoid the text from getting too wide on mobile and tablet devices. So anyhow, I hope you learned something, and thank you for watching.